figure it out. I was looking at that picture and I was like, is that a Syrian? I can't, I couldn't place my finger on it. Anyway. Yeah. Alright, so, you guys ready?
Yeah, go ahead.
Welcome back. It's the Open Peace Podcast. We have a special episode today. We have a guest, Zahir, Palestinian, joining us with Amir, Kane, and Abood. Zahir, tell us about yourself. Like, I know you're Palestinian, but from where?
Good to be on here, guys. I'm a Palestinian from the West Bank. I lived most of my life there. Went overseas for final years of school and university and stuff. From Nablus, Jenin area. Yeah, I'm very passionate about the topic.
Yeah. So,
Absolutely.
Cool. Nablus, you're kind of near me. I live near Nablus, so.
Yeah, Abood, your neighbor.
yeah, let's say like Abood lives on top of the hill looking down upon all the peasants.
Yeah, we're from one of the. Our family's been in Nablus for a long time. And we had a house actually in the old city, and knew a bunch of Samaritan families, or like Samaritan converts or something, but Samaritan descendant families in the area in Nablus.
Yeah, it used to be in the old city. Yeah.
Yeah.
About 150 of them at least at that point.
And what happened? Like, didn't they all like move up the hill at a certain point due to violence?
Yeah, they moved up
There.
like 40 years ago.
Okay.
From Nablus to the
It's
mountain,
kind
yeah.
of a shame when you see these communities kind of be uprooted and moved, even when it's literally just like a kilometer away. You know,
Yeah, absolutely.
and these old neighborhoods.
And Zahir, what's your like relationship like with the Samaritans? Do you interact with them a lot?
So when I say, I don't, I've never interacted with, I don't know if the Samaritans have been in Nablus other than like as merchants for quite some time. But a lot of the families, so that you kind of know people by their clan, right? So a lot of the families in Nablus are known to be Samaritan converts to, Islam. We say like Aslam, they're Samaritan, that's their, origin. And so a big portion of Nablus's population are descendant from Samaritans. I think, and Abood can probably clarify a bit further,
you're
but there
right.
was a,
Well, since Nablus
in the
is
Ottoman
part-
era.
Yeah, since Nablus is like basically a part of Mount Gerizim, that's where most of the Samaritan population resided. And in the past, basically 500, 600 years, definitely the population of the Samaritans started to decline, maybe from conversions, but definitely you'll ask many of the Palestinians who are living in Nablus and they'll tell you the same thing, that a lot of the population here, their origins are Samaritans. In fact, the last family who converted to become a Samaritan is known as the Maslamani. Maybe you know that name, Zahir. Maslamani. So,
I think during the Ottoman era there was a big massacre as well, quite a large one under Ottoman rule, and that's where the story goes. No, in Damascus.
In Damascus,
so a big part of the community. And so the Nablus community then continued, and then the diaspora sort of returned, and then they kind of kept a presence there. And I think the last a few different lines of Samaritans died out. One of the lines, and then by the end of but by my generation, my grandfather's generation, the community was tiny. It would have been like 100 people or something.
Yeah, and we came to be known as the Palestinian Jews. I'm sure you heard this term before.
Yes. I mean, but the Samaritans, we call them out, and then I think obviously the Jewish community in Hebron as well, and so a few other places. But in Nablus, definitely.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
It's always interesting, like, talk about these family roots, because I mean, like, it's also like a big part of like just everything that goes on here. Like, one of the big things people end up screaming about is like, like, where were your grandparents from? That kind of question,
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
A lot of Jews have to answer that question, where it's just like, doesn't matter where my grandparents are from. I was born here. you know? And even like if we're gonna, why stop at grandparents also, like if you go even further back, like as far back as possible, like we all came from here.
Mhm.
True.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's funny you should mention that, Jared, because me and Zahir, we spoke, I think a week ago, a few days ago, about connection to the land, and both of us having spent time abroad, away from the land, and still yearning to be back and to eat the food and to enjoy the good weather and to benefit from living over here. And I think it's something that maybe people get a bit mixed up on both sides of the fence. Some pro-Israel supporters don't see the right land that the Palestinians have, and same goes for maybe pro-Palestinians who don't see any right for a Jewish state to exist. So maybe, Zahir, if we can talk a little bit about Palestinian history and obviously the roots in the land and the ties to the land, I think it's something that could really help our listeners maybe understand a little bit more about the Palestinian connection to the land.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you sort of have to break it down into two different things. So I think a lot of the when people talk about the origins of the Palestinian identity or Palestinian nationalism, that tends to be more recent. So you're talking about, Harakat the Istiqlal Party, a response to the Franco-Syrian War. It's all much more recent history. As far as the history of the Palestinian people in the land and the origins of the different tribes, the different groups of people, that's when the history goes a lot further back. And so that, I mean, that's the very first thing you probably want to start by separating. There's been a constant attempt at kind of like reducing the Palestinian identity to, when the birth of Palestinian nationalism began, but the people's presence and connection to the land sort of is at the core of who they are. So even you can start with the notion of Arab tribes and how they work. So you ask anybody what their last name is, if they're from a clan or say Ashira, you get a decent sense of where they're from when they've arrived at the land, what their story is. You can name any of the big clans. The Barghouthis, the story goes, arrived from Spain about 1,000 years ago. The Tamimis were there at least before Umar al-Khattab. So the Tukhans, the Nimr, the Zaydanis, all these different clans, these Ayyan clans and Ashiras have a story when they came to the land, when they split off from the tribe and began to have their own identity. And the tribes themselves have different origins. So people like to say, well, you're Arab, you're from the Arabian Peninsula, but actually the history of Arabs in the land, whether it's the Nabateans or the Kadarites, some of the very first Arab civilizations began in the Levant. So there are Adnanite Arabs who see themselves as like descendants of Ishmael in their folklore, and Qahtani Arabs. So Bani Adnan effectively originates in the Levant, heads down to the Hijaz, wars with Qahtani tribes, and sort of returns to the land in many different waves. After the Kadarite kingdom falls, you have the Nabateans, and then waves of immigration from the Nabateans, like the Azad tribe.
By the way, Karite?
Kadarites, Qedar, Mamlak Qaidar,
I believe the Kedarites were in the northern Hijaz, I think. Am I correct on that?
It's the north of Arabia, the south, all the way up to the Sinai and the Negev, so the south of modern day Palestine, Israel. There's actually a few archaeological sites for the Kadarites inside of the south of Israel, Palestine today. Yeah, and that's actually sort of immediately south of the ancient kingdom of Judea. And when the Kadarite kingdom fell, then the Nabateans sort of absorbed the land that they had. Now these tribes are still the root of modern day Arab tribes today. So Al-Azad comes from Bat, like the Nabatean, so goes again in folklore. The extent to which this is historically accurate is similar to the tale of the 12 tribes, 12 sons of Jacob. So but whether or not it's exactly right, beside the point, that modern day genetic studies and anthropology gives some credence to this folklore on both sides. So this is something like this origin tale is about right. And so Azadi tribe, the Azad tribe, for example, is from the Nabateans. Adnan, which is the father of later more well-known tribes like Banu Hashim, in Quraysh is the father of Adnanite Arabs. This was a big part of the identity up until fairly recently. You had the Qaisi-Yamani conflict all the way up until the late 1800s. So people had a notion of who they are, and this very much impacted people's lives. And most of our politics was defined by these tribes. So, in a sense, they see the cultural origin, has kind of coming in the land of these like old tribes, as well as then when they became Mashair, they would tend to be an event that defined their identity and their name. And so, when the Zaydanis arrived in the land, or the Tuqans, or the Nimmers, the Tamimis, they developed an identity around a particular region in many, many cases. Some of the clans were sort of bigger, other clans were smaller, but, the Tuqans have always been in Nablus. The Nimmers are an old Nablus family. The Zaydanis are from Makkah. They moved there in Salah ad-Din, so that's actually quite recent. That's only like 700, 800 years ago. On the other hand, the Tamimis were there, upwards of almost 1,500 years. So they were there when Umar al-Khattab showed up, so they'd been there sort of earlier. And that's the clans. The Falahi probably have sort of the oldest presence in the land, and some of it's potentially pre-exile. They'd be made up of converts, potentially from Samaritans, Jews, and Bronze Age Levantine cultures.
Who are from Samaritans? The Falahis, or I misheard you?
No, in Nablus, there tends to be most of. Any Samaritan ethnicity would probably be in Nablus.
We already talked about, yeah.
But the Falahis tended to be the most sedentary. The most, they tend to stay in the same place
That's
the most.
Interesting
And
thing,
so,
because falah, doesn't it mean the person who kind of like farms?
farmer.
Okay.
Yeah, so they were peasants, they were farmers. So the clans tended to arrive with some level of power or some level of significance from elsewhere. So they tended to come and go, particularly the Ayyan clans, the notable clans and stuff. The Husseinis are an easy example. So the Husseinis claim descent from Ali ibn Talib, so the Prophet's family. And so each of the families kind of has a story of when they showed up. The Jarrars from the Assassinids. So a lot of these clans tended to have a story of when they showed up and come with some position of power and some amount of family already. The Falahi tended to continue to convert, with different empires. And so they tended to have sort of the oldest origin in the land and would just basically live under whoever ruled them. And actually a lot of the Falahi tribal dress kind of indicates the different cultures that had influence on them along the way. So you see the patterns change with the Byzantines, and then again with the Ottomans, and you can kind of see each civilization as it shows up leave its influence on the local Palestinian Falahis. For the land basically is people's entire identity. If you're from a clan that's from like Jenin, that is the birthplace of your name, basically. You've got your Diwan there. Some of the older families still have these like old fortresses, or Qaryat al-Kursi, throne villages that their clan was based out of for a very, very long time. And so the connection to the land is sort of very, very fundamental. And then for the Falahis, they lived off the land, and so they're all farmers, and that relationship, that cycle of harvest and cultivating the land is just basically entire. Most of who they are, and for a lot of them, they don't even remember where they were from, other than their village. We're from this village. We don't remember when we moved here, if we ever moved here.
This kind of
Some
explains to me.
no.
Not to cut you off here, but like you're making the picture of why we have different accents and different cities here. Like we don't see that in Israel, like many different accents. But now
there's
and all
some
that.
slight variation, but it's
very
mainly
little variation.
yeah, it's
Zahir, you
very
can agree with
very
me,
little.
yeah, but-
The main accent variation depends on like the type of Jews that influence the area.
Mhm.
Like Yemenite Jews and Moroccan Jews will have a very Arabic, like type of accent. They'll use a lot more Arabic in their everyday speech. even if they don't know what the words exactly mean. They just know how to use it. You know, like it's very common.
The old, I think the older Mizrahi held on to the letters, but then the younger generation doesn't do it anymore. But they would still pronounce the ha and the ayin.
Well, that's it. The Yemenites, they actually pronounce Hebrew the most correctly, using the ha and the ayin. And
they're very guttural.
I think they tend, they tend to try as well to continue it with the kids and the family.
Yeah, they pass it on, don't they?
Yeah,
they try to.
Yeah. I can tell you, there's a lot of Yemenite Jews that I met in the army who, like, at first I was convinced they were Arabs until, like, I talked to them and they were just like, yeah, no, dude, I'm Jewish as hell. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
I mean, like, but that's kind of like the thing with Jewish identity. And, I mean, it's interesting hearing you talk about Palestinian identity and connection to the land, because it mirrors Jewish identity so much. Like, I mean, like, I've always, like, held that, like, Jews and Arabs in particular are cousins, but Jews and Palestinians are closer. Like, you see a lot of parallels between Jews and Palestinian Arabs, like, specifically. Like, when it comes to the connection to the land, like, we were taken out in chains. Everything that we had was destroyed and then built on top of. And the land's always been the focal point of the identity, which is like something that you talked about with, like, these Palestinian clans and tribes who have been connected to the land, always know the story of it. Like, it's the same thing with Jews. You just swap Arabic for Hebrew. That's essentially what it is, you know?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels between the two identities, including more recently the diaspora. I mean, we're just beginning our diaspora journey now, where so much of Palestinian poetry and Palestinian music and literature is about al-shatat, life in the diaspora, and the pain of being in the diaspora.
Yeah, it's and trust me, that's a pain we know very well. It's something that's kind of central to Jewish identity. It's
the exile, Roman exile.
Yeah, exactly. The Roman exile, the most recent one. It only ended in 1948, technically. The Roman exile.
Yeah.
And and even today, the memory of it still dominates Jewish life. You know, like, I say this as somebody who was born in the diaspora, grew up in the diaspora.
Right.
Like, the feeling of, not being amongst your own people. You feel kind of limited in how you can express your Judaism. You can express your identity just because of, like, the outside influences, Yeah.
And that's, like, the driving force, really, behind the Zionist movement and behind Zionism as a concept, And so I wanted to see what you thought, Zahir. What does Zionism actually mean to you when you think about it? How do you relate to it?
I mean, my answer is probably a bit more complicated than that of the average Palestinian. Like, the average person in the land, the average Palestinian would give you a simpler answer. I mean, to them it just means, it's like ethno-nationalism or the Jewish supremacy, I think, is probably what it means to most Palestinians. I've kind of delved into the history and stuff, and so I understand its roots, the Dreyfus Affair, Herzl. I've read Dudgefield and Start. I kind of know I understand part of what he's. Yeah, I'm very familiar with the history. I think political Zionism, so the idea of having a Jewish majority state is like a fundamental basis for safety, is sort of separate to, say, cultural Zionism, which is a desire to recreate Jewish culture, revive a lost civilization, have a homeland. And I think one as soon as you apply, political Zionism to a land where you are not the ethnic majority, one kind of more or less necessitates ethnic cleansing or, land partition that people were going to resist. Cultural Zionism, on the other hand, particularly in the earlier days of Ahad, when he was a bit more pleasant, when he was a bit less disillusioned, it doesn't really require that. So I think Palestinians have a very different narrative of how Zionism has impacted the land to what Israeli Jews do. Like on the one hand, they see Zionism as having fulfilled this dream of having returning to the homeland, returning from exile, and for Palestinians, it's the other side of a nightmare. But it tends to be political Zionism that we tend to take issue with more. And I think certainly if you look at Jalid Palestine, like a Palestine newspaper, and the writings of like Isa and Isa in the early 1900s, we tended to take issue the most, not with necessarily Jewish immigration or return to the land or even the culture. Not that there wasn't some of that, but there's like a diverse set of opinions about that. But what there was consensus on was the idea of the central doctrine of being a demographic majority in a place you currently weren't kind of necessitates transfer. It necessitates somebody has to leave. There's no real way to have a viable homeland without ethnically cleansing the population, or forcing a population out. And so that's why people take issue with like Zionism at its core. It's not so much Jewish culture or history. I think Palestinians are actually, Palestinian people were actually much more comfortable with Jewish history and Jewish people prior to sort of like the second Aliyah onwards, prior to the early 1900s, basically pre-Balfour, and saw that as part of their own history. And I think a lot of Falahis would have been more comfortable saying that they are Jewish roots. Not very long ago. In fact, it used to be very common. I'd say I think there's a very decent number of Palestinians would have Jewish roots, converted to Christianity and later Islam, or different stories along the way. But nowadays, there's a desire to sever themselves from that more because of the history they've had with this movement.
Zahir, do you think that they are that their view has changed towards Zionism or towards Judaism after the second Aliyah? Because, well, I don't know if you agree with me, but a lot of Palestinians, they view Zionism as, it's almost like Zionism used religion as a kind of an excuse in a way. That's like many Palestinians view it as that. They used the
Torah.
I'd
say so. I'd say so. I mean, look, we are tribal people, so I'd say that Palestinians see Jewish people as a collective to some extent. So they will judge them as a collective to some extent. It's very different to European anti-Semitism though. So it's just basically like, well, you're the group we have a problem with, and then they need to divide that group down. And generally the way they divide the group is basically via going Zionism and then anti-Zionists. So the good guys are the Zionists and the bad guys are the anti-Zionists. Israelis hear that, and because for them Zionism is just basically, I was born here, and so I think that they've kind of reduced it and separated it from its sort of original ideological history. They take that to mean basically us, like, those of us who are here, they're the ones that they're referring to. But I think we see it as sort of relatively detached from religion.
Yeah. I mean, but that also comes into another concept of Jewish identity that I find is quite hard for Goyim, just to be quite frank with my language, that they struggle to understand, is that the cultural, secular, and religious aspect of being Jewish are intrinsically linked. It's so like when people say, oh, Zionism just uses religion as an excuse to do bad things, first off, it's a misunderstanding of what Zionism is, and second, it's a misunderstanding of what Jewish people are. And that's something, because I wanted to bring it back to what you said before, when you said that before, like the second wave of Aliyah, Palestinians saw like Jewish history as part of their own. That's part of one of the things Zionism was designed to fight against. Overall assimilation, all the larger groups that are around us kind of absorbing us and our history into their own. That was kind of one of the tenets. So, like, one of the biggest things, and you also saw a lot of Mizrahi Jews say in the earlier days of Zionism, when Mizrahi Jews were starting to come into the land, they would fight back against the idea of Arab nationalism because, they didn't really think of themselves as Arabs. They thought of themselves as Arab influenced, but the Arab nationalist identity that was kind of really starting to bloom was kind of like telling them who they are, trying to absorb them forcefully. So I feel like the rise in Arab nationalism actually kind of like forced a lot of Mizrahi Jews into the Zionist movement in the same way that the nationalist movements of Europe and their particular brand of anti-Semitism and othering drove Jews away from Europe.
I think there's two sides to that. So obviously there was a pushback against the Haskalah, Jewish enlightenment, which sort of said let's assimilationists and whatnot, and so decided to preserve the identity and the people as a separate group. And the interplay between religion, ethnicity, and culture is obviously relevant. Jewish people being sort of like an ethno-religion. And I think that, yes, a lot of Palestinians struggle with that, or Arabs struggle with that, but I think that's actually because of our own identity, partially as well, in the sense that Arab is a meta-ethnicity. So if you are Mustarab, we say, like Arabized, if you speak the language and you have the culture, then you are Arab. You can have Berber origins or Muslim origins, or ethnically Jewish, but if you have this identity, then you are sort of waved in. I mean, even the origins of like the term and whatnot, we refer to a lifestyle and a way of life, and then kind of started to link in with religion and with culture and whatnot. And so to this day, people struggle to not see the Mizrahi as Arabs because they speak Arabic. They were born in the land, and so we just give them the identity. Now, when they choose to sever themselves from the identity, then they get to have a separate identity. But like, it is sort of meta-ethnicity. So I think that is part of why people, see it in that way. As far as, look, a conversation about the history of Zionism would be a very, very, very long one.
It's so dense.
Yeah, and we're really talking about modern Zionism. So it's sort of like, more recent. Obviously, Zionism pre sort of Herzl, pre-Herzl, pre the late 1800s, the Zionist Congress and whatnot. A general desire to return to the land, obviously that's been there since the exile. So a general desire to return to Zion, to return to Zion. Obviously that's very fundamental to Jewish people and Jewish history. I think the state elements of it, so political Zionism, which is that the way we achieve this is the way other European states have. I think that's where people start to take issue with the history. So and different forms of Zionism, and religious Zionism is very different to. The reality is, religious Zionism is so different to what Herzl had in mind, or cultural Zionism even. Yeah,
I think though that really when you strip all of the extra stuff away that people have attached to what Zionism means, the truth of it is that the definition we go by is just the right to self-determination in the land. And we definitely don't feel like that means that, Palestinians can't be here too. And there's obviously layers and layers and layers to that. But people, the connotations that come with it now are an unfortunate sort of byproduct of what certain people have done in the name of Zionism, but it's not really the way we view it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's plenty of different ways to look at it.
Schools maybe don't do a great job here in Palestine here, if you know what I mean, Zahir, at showing exactly what this whole Jewish story is all about, maybe, it's...
Yeah, look, I think there's two sides to it. So I think people want to start to redefine these terms or redefine what it means, but are unwilling to acknowledge what Zionism did. So it's like you can begin to redefine. You can basically look at your word. So you get to say this is what it means. I don't think defining Zionism as just Jewish self-determination is accurate in terms of the history, but that is one way to simplify it. It's probably what it means today. Look, I think that that's fair enough. It's Jewish people's word, so Jewish people get to define what that word means. And Zion is an old Jewish term. That said, Palestinians aren't stupid as well. Like,
No, of course
you know,
Never
so-
would claim such a thing.
no, I'm not referring to you guys. I just mean like there is also this desire to like clean the history as if to pretend that it's very difficult to we are the flip side of what it required to create that state. Similar to the foundations of many states in the past. There is a process that it went through where there was a group of people that was transferred off their lands, properties destroyed, and so you have the Nakba and the Naksa and sort of this like long history of since. And I do think that people have to come to terms with that, just like lots of states have to come to terms with their own history and what they've done to get to this point. You can't start to break down these connotations until there's an acknowledgement, really, of the history. And the reality is that the leaders of these movements were very flawed people, I think, with a lot of immoral ideas. And that's common to a lot of heroes for a lot of movements, whether it's the United States or in the UK or wherever. But I don't see people being ready to start to acknowledge that history just yet.
I mean,
I think it's part of
that's kind of what we're trying to do here is get stuff out in the open, just have people finally have this discussion. Show that it's possible to have this discussion, to meet each other halfway.
Exactly. I just wanted to add on to that, Zahir. So on the flip side, when if we're looking at, say, responsibility of early Zionists and things that happened here and displacement villages that happened, and the Nakba, like you said, do we also have to look at the Palestinian side and look at people like who was in leagues with the Nazis and who was visiting Germany during the war? Do we have to kind of get each side to see the wrongs that have happened? So like one of the things we were looking at as well before this podcast is like Jew terror and Palestinian terror, and two different kind of events that led to the murder of Palestinians, that led to the murder of Jews. And these were both examples of terror. So, people going out and committing horrific acts, not being connected to any type of organization, just going out and committing these acts. If we can get people to see that the fact that these acts are happening is wrong, and that this needs to be stopped, regardless of whether it's a Jewish person killing a Muslim or a Muslim person killing a Jew. Is that something that we need to deconstruct in how do we do it? How do we kind of get to that point where we can say, look, guys, we've made mistakes along the way. It's time to correct those mistakes and move forward in a different way. Yes.
You need to be a good Samaritan, Amir. No, just kidding.
Yeah. Also, are you going to share any of those chips, Zahir? I hear you chewing away. I hear something.
They're actually nicotine.
Oh, okay.
Nicotine. I'm trying very hard not to smoke throughout the call, otherwise. So sorry for the voice.
Bro, I get that. I get that struggle so goddamn.
Wait a few years back, it's good on you. But not.
Yeah. Yeah. Because that leads into something that our unseen partner wanted me to bring up to you. So, first thing is that on the show we're not afraid to call out the failings of the Israeli state. That's part of how we make our country better. Mm-hmm. One of those was the Duma arson attack, the Wabsheh family that was burnt, aged 32, 36, and 1 respectively, killed in an arson attack. Which, it was a terrible fucking thing to have happened. Especially one of the victims was a fucking 1-year-old. It's a baby.
Yeah.
Terrific.
Done by a 21-year-old Jew, which I think kind of goes to show where the conversation about this whole thing is heading in Israel now that we're at a point where our political leadership doesn't want to solve anything. They just want to manage the conflict. Meanwhile, as it keeps on boiling, our own people are getting more and more extreme.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
I think. Go
yeah,
on.
go ahead, Zay, go on.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that, like, I think there is there is an enormous gap in narrative between the two sides. So yeah, I mean, you take a look at like the Duma, arson attack, and that's obviously a particularly horrific case. And if you talk to like the averages really about that, the response I get will be just something like, obviously that's the actions of a civilian. On the flip side, we sort of remember like the days of like Lehi, and old like Jewish paramilitary, Zionist paramilitary groups and stuff. And so they used to, yeah, I mean, they used to use terror tactics and stuff. And I think,
Lehi wasn't just terrorists; they were a straight up fascist organization.
yeah, and that's still sort of a part of the. Well, I mean, Ergun as well. And is it Ergun or Lehi that eventually became a political party and then later Likud today?
That would be Irgun. Lehi kind of fell by the wayside because there was the three big ones were the Haganah, first and foremost. That was the left-wing militia. Irgun, which was the right-wing militia. That would later on go to be Likud. And Lehi, which was always kind of small-ish. It was also alternatively called the Stern Gang because it was more of a particularly large gang rather than like an actual force, which makes sense for how extreme Lehi was. Lehi kind of fell by the wayside after it was disarmed by Haganah when Haganah formed the backbone of what would later become the IDF.
Yeah, I mean, as I understand, there was, I don't know the right pronunciation is, but a havlaga, which is self-restraint. So there was a desire for Lehi and Ergun splitting off in order not to have to exercise self-restraint. Yeah, I mean, people who descend from the different villages in the Nakba remember these like paramilitary groups in different ways. That they have these like this history with it, and then kind of the nature of the attacks and stuff.
It's the us versus them mentality, that's all with people.
Yeah. And
yeah. So also we were, Jared and I were having a bit of a conversation earlier today, and we were comparing the Duma arson attack with
the Itamar massacre.
Yeah. Which is, a similar act of violence the other way around. Few people killed, and also terrible act. And three of them were young kids too.
It was a whole family of 5, 3 of which were kids, 11, 4, and 3. Hold on. Pull it up.
Yeah, 11, 4, and 3, that's right.
Yeah, there was, so like we were comparing them, and the Duma arson attack, there was one person that was, there was one assailant. He was caught and sentenced to life imprisonment for a terrorist act, which in Israel, life imprisonment for a terrorist act is like the rest of your life.
Life imprisonment, yeah.
Yeah, it's what it means. A normal life sentence is like 20 to 30 years, depending. But for terrorist acts, like that's like you go away forever. And he received 1 count of life imprisonment. But the 2 Palestinian militants who killed this family of 5, they each received 5 sentences. 5 life sentences.
Yeah.
So we were just comparing, because I mean, they were both horrible acts of violence against children especially.
Yeah.
It's absolutely fucking disgusting. But we just thought about like the difference between a Jewish terrorist and a Palestinian terrorist, or the 2 Palestinians who were sentenced got 5 life sentences.
Yeah.
The Jewish terrorist only got 1, even though the end result is going to be the same.
So do you find that interesting, Zahir? How do you react to that?
Sort of. I try to stay away from comparing individual cases and getting too sucked into that, because I think people will... I see it as beside the point. Like, I see this as being the very, very ugly consequence of the conflict. But I do see that, like, when you zoom out, I I never saw the conflict as like a cycle of violence. I really didn't. I really don't feel like that's what defines it. I feel like violence is a consequence of politics or ideology. But when I say it's not a cycle of violence, I mean it's not Montagues and Capulets. We aren't fighting because of a cycle of revenge attacks. If that was the case, then every single Arab tribe would never. I mean, the entire Middle East would be an endless, vendetta.
Revenge.
But like the reality, we have
that's what the conflict was. There would only be one group of people left here, if I'm going to be honest.
Well, not so much. Well, I mean more that there is a culture of basically, if this was just about revenge, you killed my brother, and so I go and kill your brother, then they generally, we have that in the culture, and there's a sulh, a reconciliation, a moment where two tribes make peace and they move on. But I see it as ideological, and I see it as political. I mean, ultimately, I see it as a consequence of trying to fit a square peg. This is just sort of the Palestinian narrative. Let's try to fit a square peg in a round hole. I see it as about demographics. It's about like how, if Palestinians were 20% of the population right now, we would all be incorporated into some kind of, like the Arab Israelis, the Palestinians from 48 lands. It would be simple. There'd be no conflict. But the issue is that we're still post the Nakba and the Naksa, post the exile of 1 million people, half the population. So we pose a demographic threat, and I think there's no solution to that. So I do see it all stems from this stuff. Like there is no clear solution simply because you have a square peg in a round hole. You have a country that basically there's like 300,000 Jews and Israeli Jews in East Jerusalem, around 500 something thousand in the West Bank. So that poses like problems with any two-state solution. I mean, it was so difficult to evacuate Gaza. Forget evacuating 800,000 people. And then you have like a cultural Zionism versus political Zionism thing. On the one hand, a lot of those settlers will tell you, well, I want to live in this land. This is, I have a historical connection to this land. Why can't I live here? Which would be fine under the guise of, like equal rights for everybody in the land. And then on the flip side, someone in Tel Aviv or, Katamon or something will tell you, well, it's very important to me to have a Jewish majority state. And so you kind of can't square the two pegs. So these are these like high-level ideological, political issues. And as soon as you try to make those a reality, then violence breeds, comes out of that. But so I see it as a side effect rather than
maybe
a
also,
cause.
if you think about it here. Is it a build of hatred in a way that they can find ways to kind of fill that somewhere?
Yeah, I mean the hatred builds over time as well. Yeah, totally. I mean, you have this long history, making it harder and harder to reconcile.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, as you were talking about the Israeli Arabs, like, is that, like, what would be your ideal situation for the Arabs of the West Bank? Would it be Israeli citizenship, just like annex, get it over with, fuck
exactly
it?
what I was going to ask.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. See me, this guy, this Mancunian fuck right here, we have the same brain. It's scary. We're both afraid.
Oh.
Sure. So, I mean, first of all, we talk. Ideal is a strong word. I mean, there's ideal, and then there's what you can do. So, I mean, I see a few things. I don't believe in partition of land. I don't even think that it makes sense. Palestinians don't. We don't have our own darjud and stuff. This was never about demographics. I mean, I don't think we necessarily. I think our history kind of, where we clashed with initially was political Zionism. Well, that's at least what our intellectuals and our writers initially spoke about. And I don't understand how someone from like Jenin or Nablus, can, on behalf of a Palestinian from Akka, who I assume has the same connection to land that I do, say, well, you have to be on the other side of the border. Or you can't live here, and then I'm in the land that I'm attached to. So I don't believe in partition of the land as either necessary or a good idea. And so I don't believe in the right of the PA or any of our leadership to sit there and negotiate giving away land. I just don't think. That's not really how land works. It's like it doesn't get used up. Like both groups of people can't have it in the same place. I think it then comes down to a governance issue.
Amir's dying in the corner.
You okay, man?
1 second. All right. It's still alive. Did you get the sickness out of you? You see, dude, that's why you gotta get this. That's why you gotta get the shot, man.
Yeah, so that's an interesting. I wasn't actually going to ask that exact question that you asked, Jared, but I wanted to say if somehow we came to the situation where they were going to go with like a one-state solution, do you think that there are a decent amount of Palestinians that would be happy to accept an Israeli citizenship, or is it really, really important to those people to have their own Palestinian ID?
It's not that it's not so much. It's basically almost any citizen. It's any ID. There's two sides to it. The most important thing is being on the land, right? So connection to the land. This is our homeland. We don't want to sell the land. People want to stay in this thing that their identity comes from. Statehood and Palestinian nationalism is then born out of this, both a longer history, but then most recently, and one of the strongest effects is a desire for, at one point the Muslim-Christian Association asked to be part of Syria. We thought that would be the easiest, way to set up the country in order for us to stay on our land and still have our, freedom. I don't know if everybody knows that, but we were always part of Syria under the Ottomans, and this is very, very old. This isn't relevant today, but gives you an idea of how this nationalism is fairly new. On the other hand, the Israeli flag, for me, growing up, was literally the worst possible image in the world. So it's just it's terror, it's fear. It's just soldiers coming into my house at 2 a.m. in the morning, hitting my father, shoving us in a room. It's like, it is this, it's like Lord Voldemort for us. So yeah. I really don't think that there's would people accept it? Maybe. I think so. Would that be an end to, would they be happy about it? No. I personally think we are in everything but a technical apartheid, and the reason before that is the PA. So we are sort of maybe two separate states. On the other hand, it's almost like a vassal state. The West Bank is kind of a vassal state.
What are you going to name that state,
Israel.
By the way? Because I have people who, if I say Palestine, Israelis, for example, would get offended. And if I say Israel, a lot of Palestinians would get offended. You see?
I guess it can be like the UK. It doesn't really matter. People can just have a dozen different identities. I don't see Palestinians taking on Israeli identity anytime soon. I don't think you could call the state. I'm not
asking if they would call themselves Israelis. I'm just asking, would they accept the Tudat Zehut and, accept Israeli authority and Israeli law and become citizens? They can remain Palestinian in their core. Of course, we're not trying to take that.
Yeah.
If Palestinians had equality, then that state wouldn't be Israeli law, because we'd be able to run for office, participate in the society. We'd be part of the same country. It's not, so, frankly, when I look at the history, my narrative, my telling of the history is if you go all the way back to sort of pre-Nakba, then we wouldn't have had an issue with, a massive, pre-Balfour, a massive Jewish population inside the land. I think this is more of a problem for political Zionism, which is what does it mean to be a Jewish state? And you are still a Jewish state if you have, 51% Arab, Palestinian population. And so I think it probably looks more like a federation of sorts, everyone must have fundamental equality under the law. But then the land probably looks like Scotland and England and Wales, You have a bunch of fairly strong, distinct identities. But everyone has equality under part of some greater union. So I think that's the most realistic thing. There's a very, very long history of, in my view, oppression. So there is no desire to accept the identity of the one thing that represents that. But on the other hand, you just can create a new identity on top of it, and then have assimilation. So you can have like a united, united, the Union of Jerusalem or something, and basically ensure equality under the law. Because that's the primary thing. If you give people fundamental, equal human rights, civil and political, if I'm equal to, an Israeli Jew in this broader union, in the land that I call my home, which I call Palestine, they call Eretz Israel, it doesn't really matter. This becomes like a Scottish English thing. And then I think there's an acknowledgement of the history that's necessary. And I think if this like Truth and Reconciliation Commission of that type event occurs, then that would change the perspective of one side about the other.
Yeah. I mean, like, when I think of a situation like this, because like for me, when I think about like what I particularly want, like I'm that guy that you said earlier who's like lives in Israel proper. Like having a Jewish and democratic state is more important than like having the West Bank. Like I'm that guy. The West Bank, I mean, it would be nice to have. I feel a connection to the West Bank, but if I was to choose between the West Bank and the Jewish democratic nature of Israel, I would choose to be Jewish and democratic, like without a second thought. But I know, like when I think, because like I don't see that happening. I see eventually the West Bank becoming part of like a single state with the rest of Israel. I have no idea what's going to happen with Gaza. I think Gaza is going to end up becoming its own thing. That's like, I legit think that's just what's going to happen. And I don't know, I kind of see the future of the West Bank Arabs as like becoming, an expansion of Arab Israelis, which might take a generation or two to have them get to the point of our Arab Israeli citizens. But I don't know. That's the only way I can see it. I mean, like in the end, abandoning the Jewish nature of the state kind of scares me. I'm going to be honest.
I mean, it depends. It depends on a bunch of things, right? So I don't actually think this. Like, I don't think an ideal version of the way I would set up. If I had omnipotent power, and kind of took neither side, I wouldn't set the country up into two distinct regions. I'd break it down into like a state of little cantons. More like Switzerland. So I actually think there's tremendous issues inside of Israeli politics totally separately to the Israeli-Palestine conflict. So what you just said is the view of... Well, not everyone agrees. It's like two Jews, 50 opinions.
I also, before you go any further, I also just want to say that I appreciate you taking the time to pronounce things in Hebrew and your knowledge of Jewish culture. I really didn't expect it. It's kind of awesome.
Thank you. So the problem is that there's people who disagree with you and they disagree with you extremely strongly. So a lot of people actually, and this is part of the way the coalitions work. So a lot of people say, so I brought up this early comparison between cultural Zionism and political Zionism early on. But a different group of people would say basically, is a Jewish state just a state of Jews, or is it a state that is your homeland, the center of Jewish culture, or Jewish identity? I think Herzl was wrong. Like, I think he was partially right. I think you will always be persecuted if you're a tiny minority. I think there is a need for there to be a refuge, a center for your culture, your people, if you want to survive. But, Israeli Jews make up half the population of the land today, and that's including Gaza. If there was a one state tomorrow...
Because, like, if you include Gaza, then yeah, it's a lot closer.
Yeah.
If it's just the West Bank, it's like, 56 to 60%, I think?
Yeah, around 60%. Around 60% of the land. I'll get to the Gaza thing in a moment, but regardless, you are never going to be a minority in the land ever. I mean, that's sort of never going to happen. A meaningful minority. You might be 45, 48% at one point in a different year. You'll be like 52, 53%. That all depends on birth rates. I mean, at this stage, you may be a minority relative to the Haredis in 30 years' time.
That's a whole nother episode you just opened up.
Yeah.
Why would you do that to us? Why would you do that?
This idea, but the idea that this like Dreyfus affair type threats where you are 1% or 2% of a population and there is tremendous persecution is just sort of not relevant here anymore. For better or for worse, there is now going to be forever this one of the the plurality, like a massive portion of the land is always going to have a very strong Jewish identity now. And so that's not so much relevant per se. I think people get concerned about it. They just think of the Knesset the way it is now, and they go, we can barely agree. If we add another 2.8 million Arabs to the equation, what will our politics look like afterwards? I mean, that would be...
That's a main right-wing fear. It's like...
And I think they're basically right. So I really think there is... I think you need constitutional reform. So I actually think that...
Absolutely do. Like,
I think that
everybody on this side of the line agrees on that.
Yeah.
Just don't know.
I think that therein sort of lies the solution. So you have a lot of regions with fairly different political identities. If you did a heat map of the country now, it doesn't look like two states. Akka is full of Arabs, Nasr is full of Arabs, Beersheba is full of Arabs. You already have a solution.
Like all my street is like 40% Arab.
Yeah, so this isn't actually this neat like two states where it's like Northern Ireland and Ireland, and then you can just draw a border somewhere and go, okay, you guys are on your own. You guys can have this piece of the pie, and we'll take the rest, and everything's fine. I think the two are actually quite mixed. The economies are quite mixed. So the economies actually depend on a fair bit on more so the Palestinian economy today. It depends on foreign aid as well as a lot of West Bank citizens work in Israel. Construction and whatnot. Huge portion actually. So there's already a level of integration. There's the security coordination, which we aren't happy about and I don't agree with, but it is what it is right now. For better or for worse, the two governments are going to be deeply entwined regardless. And so I think what you're looking at is more like a federal system. And I think you probably shouldn't break it down into a binary too. So if you split it into like a Palestinian and an Israeli, I think it'll be inherently unstable. It might be like Belgium, so it could kind of work, a shared capital and then
Which reminds me of a question though. Sorry to cut you off, Zahir, but
go on.
Question: if a Palestinian married an Israeli woman, what does he get? Like, does he get only residency or?
There's Lem Shemel. It's complicated. The Israeli government doesn't like it when that happens. And that happens fairly often. Well, it's not that unlikely because you have to keep in mind an Israeli woman can just be a Palestinian woman with Israeli citizenship. And even then, so it's not even, I mean, like I know there's a handful of cases where there's like Arab-Jewish marriage in Israel and people get pushed back for it and stuff. But even more simply, just a Palestinian who lives in, what we call 48 lands, an Arab-Israeli, a Palestinian form, by identity potentially, marries a Palestinian from the West Bank. That could be a whole episode. What they kind of go through. Forget Israel and Palestinian though. Just a Palestinian from Gaza actually marrying someone from the West Bank is quite complicated. And then there's East Jerusalem and there's the Lam Shemel, like including, which basically just like when you incorporate someone into your family, like family reunification laws and stuff. They're quite painful. And they really try to make it very, very hard for you, basically. I mean, to kind of summarize what I was saying before, maybe like skip to the punchline, I think you need enough autonomy for areas like, in sort of like, let's call them the Jewish cantons, the Jewish states of a federation, that it feels like a Jewish majority state and that you feel like it's culturally Jewish, while having a supranational body, a federal body that ensures basically what we care about is equal criminal justice, equal civil rights, and then political autonomy. And I don't think you break that down into like two regions. I actually think you break that down into many. I think Tel Aviv is very different to Beersheba. I think Jerusalem is very different to Jenin. Jenin is very different to Ramallah. Some areas, Ramallah's, I'll go with stereotypes. These stereotypes are not perfectly accurate, and I don't want to offend anyone with them. But let's say like Ramallah is seen as very secular. Jenin is very religious. Well, on the Palestinian side, Ramallah has, bars and cafes, and it's sort of a very modern. But Ramallah is our Tel Aviv. A lot of, particularly the city. I mean, not including the villages, but Ramallah city is extremely modern. It's just like West Amman. There's bars and clubs, and it's sort of very, very, very westernized and actually quite culturally liberal. But then there's the city, in not every area, but Ramallah city is like that. In the same way, there's like a Haredi community somewhere in Tel Aviv. It's not like the whole city is like that, but basically most of Ramallah is sort of much more secular than, say, Jenin. Jenin is much more conservative, much more religious, much more traditional. You could not have the same laws in Jenin as you could in Ramallah. There would be problems. So you actually, the country looks like cantons to me. People speak different dialects. They speak in different accents. They have a long history, long culture. We're all united, all these Palestinian people, united by common struggle. But the identities of the different regions are separate. And sort of post-liberation, post-equality, I wouldn't set the country up into, I'd break it down into cantons. I think you could solve a lot of problems in Israeli politics that way. Set up a bicameral legislature, maybe a presidential system, so that basically if the politicians can't do their job, they have to. You can't go back to elections every, this is your fourth election in 2 years, and like, I don't know what the guarantee is. There won't be another one afterwards. So I think
It'll be number 5.
It'll probably happen.
Yeah, it's insane. Like,
that's a nightmare situation too.
I don't see any way that this election is going to end up with a stable government at all. I don't even know who I'm voting for.
Well, I see the conflict could be part of the equation.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
it should be.
It would be part of the solution in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest things. Well, this is something that's becoming even bigger, and you saw it in the last constitutional crisis, is what I called it, or because there was a theory that if Gantz was going to beat Bibi, Arabs were going to be part of the governing coalition for the first time ever, and the Likud ran hard on the fear of that. I'm sure you saw those billboards all up and down Ramat Gan and Tel Aviv, Kane. Those were fucking disgusting. Just straight up saying, do you want this guy as a minister? What the fuck?
100%. But look, it's not even Likud, it's Bibi. The people that keep voting for Likud, they're voting for Bibi. And he's getting old. One way or another, he's not going to be around forever.
He's getting old physically, and he's getting old politically. His time is nearing its end, and he's holding it out longer than it needs to be.
How old is he now?
It's 69, something.
No, he's 70, isn't he?
Is he?
70.
I'll Google it. I'll bring it up before we end this.
I wanted to ask you, Zahir, when you think about breaking down
71.
Yeah.
Fucking hell! A Jew at 71 does not look like that. A Jew at 71 looks like a shriveled grape. What the fuck?
He's had his injections.
It has to be.
But yeah, Zahir, I wanted to ask you about the canton system. Would you want to delegate power as much as you can down to each separate canton? And how would you break it down in terms of geography? What would Hebron be its own canton? Al-Kilia, Tulkarem, Jenin, each area, and maybe Gaza could be broken up into a few different cantons as well?
It's a great question. I mean, I actually have a map in my head and whatnot. But putting aside the specifics, at a glance, you can look at the coalitions that are there in Israeli politics today. And so you have this coalition between sort of the settler groups and then the religious right and Bibi, and this this unholy alliance between all these different groups in order to keep together a government, and it will kind of fall apart. And I think that basically this sort of a system can be part of the solution. So you have more regional autonomy. People don't actually have to agree on everything about how religious should my area be, how religious should Tel Aviv be, how religious should Beersheba be. So these areas can actually be quite different. You can have it's much easier to get a few 100,000 people to agree in a particular, we say, half of the government or state or canton and vote on their state legislature than it is to get the whole country to agree. And once you give people that autonomy on their cultural values, so, wanting what their public holidays are, what their clothes are. I know Darabanut is a big political issue inside of Israel. Like, once you give people autonomy in different regions on some of these things, people can agree on things like security, economy, equal civil rights, that if you're a citizen of this federal body, then you should have equality under the law. People can kind of agree about that, and they'll start to disagree on, like, well, if you're religious, let's say you're a traditional nationalist, or you're, you want the state to be more religiously Jewish, like that's actually important to you. And the similar thing on the Palestinian side, we have a traditional sort of equivalent traditional nationalist group, and it's very important to them that the state is more Muslim. That they basically have, like Jordan, a Sharia court for family matters, and divorces and stuff. On the other hand, in other parts of the country will be quite secular, and so you can agree on a basic bill of rights for all citizens, and then have regional autonomy in these different states, and that is many nation states. That's Switzerland. That's most federalized countries around the world. So it is sort of a working system for governance, and it acknowledges the reality of what the land looks like. And so you can have a canton of Jenin, a canton of Beersheba, a canton of Tel Aviv, Haifa, Akka. I picture like 10 cantons with relative autonomy, and then the federal government being in charge of security, border control, criminal justice, and enforcing an equal bill of rights. And then federations evolve organically from there, like every federation. So how much the federal government does then grows over time.
Yeah, I just want to play like a little bit of devil's advocate there, because just like if I'm looking at it, that solution from an Israeli perspective, let's say a very right-wing perspective, I would say, how can I trust you guys to come in now and everything's good and we've done a sulha and okay, we've come to some form of reconciliation and peace. How can we now trust that we're going to work together and that we're going to progress the country together and try and develop together as much as we can instead of fighting? Certain Israelis may see that as kind of, pardon?
I guess we need awareness. I mean, like on like the next, like how to raise the next generation, also, right? In a sense.
Yeah, for sure. But I'm just saying, like some people, and especially people in power over here, they'll hear a plan like that and they'll see joint federally, joint security, and they'll just think this will never, it's not even worth talking about, it's not realistic, it's not, even though that, like you said earlier, there is coordination between the PA and Israel now.
Yeah, so, I mean, the reality is it's almost what we live in now. It's actually almost what we live in now. The only difference is that, I mean, we inside the West Bank, we already work. So we already are part of we have an economic union. We use your currency. You control our banking. So I can barely transfer money into the country without approval from the Israeli side. You control the banking and the economy. So much of the West Bank works inside of Israel. So the economy is so dependent on the two borders. So we already have a sort of economic union. We have a joint security apparatus. We certainly feel our politicians more or less have to toe an acceptable line. They're definitely not the friends of, the PA is not Israel's friend, but their interests overlap more than they do with ours. We the people. And so we sort of already have this. I just feel we have this on the basis of, inequality. But basically we don't have equal rights, in the West Bank. And then the reality is we kind of have history as well as, like, you look at the example of the Arab Israelis to go off, to know that this sort of does work. People people naturally stay in their respective areas. So I don't see, despite the fact that there are 2 million Israelis to 2 million, roughly 2 million Arabs inside of Israel, they tend to live in their own areas. So there are the braver or more assimilated people that go and live in highly Jewish areas. But I actually think the map would look fairly similar. There would be like a 10-20% of the other in each of the cantons. but Tel Aviv would basically stay like 80% Jewish because it's just going to stay 80% Jewish and speak Hebrew with a little bit more Arabic than it does now, but not much more. Kind of like how certain places in Canada still speak French. And Jenin is not going to become Hebrewized anytime soon. It will never, probably. But Ramallah could potentially become more mixed. Or Jerusalem is probably the easiest example. People already...
Jerusalem's already split down the middle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but on the other hand, people cross, walk around to the side of the fence, so to speak, and shop in each other's shops, and so it's kind of tense. But on the other hand, like there is literally no reason other than what we feel is the history, and this is our narrative, and like an ideology that is so fixated on the demographics that it kind of can't see past its own successes almost. Like this, so much of the concerns that were there historically, they're not relevant anymore. I guess what Abud said, awareness, education, but also basically just taking it seriously.
Absolutely, Zahir. Well, listen, I grew up in Palestinian schools, all right? And also I studied in university, at Najaf University. And, for example, I don't know if you are familiar with the class called Palestinian Studies, Dirasat Palestinian?
Yeah.
At Najaf University. So I think that, like, I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but this might be a good point that, like, for example, not everything there, obviously the Israelis would agree that it's true. For example, the Holocaust being exaggerated or something like that. I think these small points are maybe kind of like borders for Palestinians maybe having empathy or something like that, perhaps, for the Israelis, and vice versa. There are stories like that. But I think also one barrier is our education system. So that's what I wanted to grow. Especially when a person is growing up, it's hard to change his ideology and his thoughts and beliefs.
Yeah, that's kind of a point I wanted to bring up about your canton idea before we have to, unfortunately, end this episode. Is that because like there's a lot of fear. I like the idea; it sounds good. Thing is that, and this is something that I'm sure like Kane, Amir, and any other Jew on this side of the line would also feel, is that if we did enter a canton system where we gave some power to, I don't know, like majority Palestinian areas in the West Bank, but I'm just going to say, and I'm sure Kane and Amir feel this way also, I don't feel safe with that. Because, I mean, like, I've met a few Palestinians, and, like, I know that, like, what they say in public can be vastly different from how they actually feel. But the end result will still end up being the same. Like, so I am saying, like, I like the idea. I want this to be solved, but I will say it, and these are things that are important to say. I'm afraid of what Palestinians will do to me if we let up security too much. I am.
I mean, right. If you let up security right now, like I won't try to give a sugar-coated version of the conversation. I mean, the hatred is high, I mean, this is like 70 years of, it's a 70-year, obviously, like conflict. Like it's, people have been oppressed for a very, very long time. There's no love lost here, between the two sides. I just think that there's a reason for that. I mean, the Palestinians are angry at the other side for a reason. They don't hate you because you were born there or because you
it feels like that, and sometimes it sounds like that's exactly what they're saying.
Some of them do, but that's extremism.
Yeah, of course.
I would actually say it's kind of what you expect. So I'd say, and I'll try to wrap it up so as to not take too long. But I would say that. Yeah, I would say it's exactly what you expect. So the majority would hate the other side, but by far, but not for being born there. There's a sense that you are complicit in a system of oppression. The reality is most Israelis are relatively disinterested in what goes on the West Bank. On the other hand, if you're someone who works for like a human rights organization or something, you get tremendous love from the other side. It's really not just about the fact that you're Jewish or that you're born there. It's seen as basically like you are part of this like system of oppression. So once you break that system down, the hatred that's left over is probably kind of like the hatred between, I don't know, two groups that used to fight together historically. But the primary source of the hatred isn't like racism or like fundamental, and there is that. There's a fair bit of that too, and I think it's there on both sides. Israeli society is quite racist. Palestinian society is quite racist. I think it's just like a Middle Eastern thing in general, or like tribal-minded.
I definitely
I
agree
think
with
that
you.
is like that's the truth.
It is.
But we also have the ability to then think better about a collective. So we have the ability to change our views of a group or a tribe and form sub-identities within that. I think there's a tremendous portion of Israeli society that has anti-Palestinian or anti-Arab like hatred and racism. I think the same thing exists on our side. But for the majority of people, the hatred is based on I think a political reality. It's like I am oppressed by the other. And if you look at civil rights movements in the past, when two people have joined forces together in order to achieve liberation, achieve equality, then I think that changes the narrative. Because if people side by side decide to change the reality of the situation, then people can no longer assume that just because you're part of this other side that you were complicit. And I think that's what changes relations between two ethnic
that's what we
groups.
need.
That's what.
Yeah. All right. Well, strong note. This was a great episode, Zahir. I would have loved to hear more about this system. I love talking about theoretical political systems. I'm an absolute nerd for that, and I would love to pick that apart more if you ever come back on the show. I hope you do. I think I speak for all of us when I say that.
Come back again in future for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's been
this
a
is a great
pleasure
episode.
here. And if you're in Nablus, don't forget you're just one step away. So,
Yeah.
Harry
Yeah,
Potter.
he's literally right there. High King of Blue
Hello.
will allow the peasant to visit upon his throne.
We'll bring you some Samaritan tahini again by Tahina Harbracha. Thank you so much.
Yeah. His family owns the factory, this corrupt bastard.
Makes sense.
Man, it's good stuff.
It is.
You
It's
gave us
actually
that
really
fresh,
good. Anyway,
fresh tuna. Man.
everyone, shut up. Episode over.
That's how we usually end, just in case.
Yeah,
you-
just, yeah.